Great to see you again, Prof. de la Porta, and it's an honour and a privilege to have the chance to speak with you today about such important topics. Donatella de la Porta is a professor of political science, Dean of the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences, and Director of the PhD program in Political Science and Sociology at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence, where she also leads Cosmos, the Centre on Social Movement Studies. Among the main topics of her research include social movements, political violence, terrorism, corruption, the police, and protest policing. She directs a major ERC project, Mobilizing for Democracy, about civil society participation in democratization processes in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America. She is the author of 90 books, 150 journal articles, and 150 contributions in edited volumes. De la Porta's publications include Legacies and Memories in Movements, 68, Passato e Presente dell'Anno Ribelle, Late Neoliberalism and its Discontents, Spreading Protest, and Blackwell Encyclopedia on Social and Political Movement. De la Porta has received various international prizes and recognitions, such as the Forschungspreis of the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung, awarded in November 2021 for life achievements as a highly prominent international scholar. Grazie, Prof. de la Porta. We'll start with a question relating to your most current research. You've recently completed a study on the so-called No-Vax social movement in Germany and Italy. What can you tell us about the similarities and differences of the movement's key concerns and manifestations within these contexts?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the honor of having me as keynote. And thank you also for arranging the logistics so that we can overcome the challenge of the different times in Italy and in Australia. I worked on anti-vax protest during a research project that addressed also progressive type of politics during the pandemic. When I mean progressive, I mean especially type of solidarity initiatives that try to help communicating about the pandemic, but also addressing the different sources of inequalities and the dramatic effect it had on in pandemic time. And those I call progressive movements, but then I also wanted to address what I call regressive movements, and I will tell you also during the addressing your questions about similarities and differences, why do I consider the protest against vaccinations and against the anti-contagion measurement as mainly regressive. I was puzzled by the fact that the news, the media presented anti-vax protest as very heterogeneous, with symbols that seems to address both left-wing and right-wing groups, and also presentations of the protest as sort of ideological. And this is why I wanted to go more in depth in the research on what usually social movement scholars consider as most important elements. So the type of repertoires of actions, the type of organizational structures, and the type of framing of the protest itself. I have more in-depth information on the Italian case, but then I added Germany and Greece as two cases. Greece was a case of a very low mobilization, Italy of intermediate, and Germany as the countries in which, especially in the beginning, the anti-vax protests were quite massive. Not really massive, but captured the attentions of the media. And in terms of similarities going through these different elements, repertoires of actions was similar in defying anti-contagion measurements. So most of these protests symbolically challenge the measures that were imposed. They happened during semi-lockdown conditions, and they refused to use masks, to use social distancing and so on. And this was very different from the protest of the progressive movement. Take, for instance, Black Lives Matter protests that happened in that period. They were highly emotional in tunes, stressing especially fear, use victimistic type of symbols with mainly banalizations of the Shoah. So the anti-vax protesters presented themselves as the Jewish people of our time, and the anti-vax measurement as parallel to the persecutions of the Jews. They had strange characteristics for social movement scholars. They were mainly middle-aged people. So usually when you look at protests, mainly young. And they were forms of protest that were quite localized and ritualized. There was radicalization in both countries, especially in interactions with the police. What was different was that in Germany, the protest started much earlier with lighter type of anti-contagion measurement. In Italy, the shock of the pandemic was much higher because Italy was the first country that was hit in Europe by the pandemic at the time in which there was very little knowledge, and so also very high rate of people who died. And in these conditions, nobody challenged in the beginning the needs for the lockdown, the needs for hard measures. While in Germany, hard measures were taken more as a preventive type of strategies, and there was more of an opposition. So protests were more long-lasting, and to a certain extent, they were larger than in the Italian case, and more violent. This is something that can be explained when looking at the organizational structures of the protests themselves, because they, in both countries, there was a convergence of radical rights groups and of new age groups. In Germany, these two milieus were to a certain extent stronger. So radical rights groups, to a certain extent, was, I guess, resonant with the idea of the far right, that you need to establish individual freedom, that the law should protect the stronger, and there was a general mistrust in the public measures and in the state. But there was also in the radical right in both countries a transformations that favored this type of instrumental connections with the anti-vax in the protest in the beginnings. And it was the radical right that already tried to go beyond its core elements and tried to occupy spaces where they saw availability in terms of type of leaning of the protests themselves. So in the far right, at the same time, there was understanding of the measures as developed by a cosmopolitan elite in a situation in which the far right moved very much towards nativist type of frames, so the protections of the nationals, but also it was connected with a move to embrace anti-gender type of positions, ultra-conservative type of positions that were resonant with the attention of the far right to the family and so on, but were also can I say, strengthened by an alliance with anti-gender groups that were born within more religious type of movement. So it was the far rights that explicitly, instrumentally penetrated this milieu, but also that offered resources in terms of organizations that were quite needed. The other type of milieu that mobilized in this protest, in both countries, was the sort of new age type of groups. And this type of milieu had also undergone development in the past. So while they were initially quite related also with environmental positions, they had developed towards a more commercialized type of positions, towards more anti-state type of positions, and general type of skepticism, so that it was not the first time that this milieu entered in contact with the far right. The conceptions of health in this milieu was very favorable to anti-vax positions, because it was assessing a strong mistrust towards say mainstream medicine, and the assessment that each of us is responsible for its own, her own or his own health. Which was a very different type of assessment than on the left, where the type of effects of the pandemic were related with social responsibility or lack of responsibility in the past towards ensuring health. So the fact that the main victims of the pandemic were often people who were suffering from long-lasting disease, like heart disease, like overweight, like diabetes, and so on, was considered in this type of protest as a proof of the fact that those who didn't care about their own health were responsible for the sickness to come. And in this sense, both milieus were present in all the, in both countries and even in Greece, but with different strength. In Germany, one of the main characteristics that explains why lower type of or less stringent type of measures produce more protest is also in the strength of the presence of political parties on the right, which is also quite strong, Alternative für Deutschland, which is very radical and very much penetrated by conspiracy theories of different types, especially great replacement theories. And this brings me to the last part of the similarities and differences, the ones related with the framing of the protest. As I then anticipated, in both countries, frames were regressive in the sense that they refused solidarity, were characterized by extreme forms of individualism, exclusive nationalism. So very often the virus was considered as a foreign virus that was introduced because of the globalizations that these movements tended to reject. In fact, one of the main symbols in all these squares were the national flags that were used to symbolize the need to return to extreme forms of nationalism, and a strong mistrust in the collective type of say bonds and reciprocal trust. And this was also related with the spreading of conspiracy theories, In Germany, it happens very soon, and it happened earlier than the pandemic itself. The penetrations of the QAnon type of conspiracies, which is a very peculiar one. It's not just, I can say, general forms of apolitical type of conspiracies, but it is very politicized, stating that Trump is the savior of the humanities against a small group of vampire cosmopolitan leaders and so on. So it's very politicized. It's very politicized on the right. Is anti-Semitic, so it has all the characteristics of several conspiracies on the right, and it has a special characteristics in terms of the ways in which the conspiracies developed. There is a secrecy which is related not only with the definitions of this almighty cosmopolitan elite that kills babies and drink bloods to remain young, but it's also the opening to different interpretations. So QAnon drops are offered to groups of activists that have to interpret them, and so they can also connect them with national type of conspiracies or characteristics. So the last example was the attempt by Bolsonaro in Brazil to do like Trump, to refuse the electoral results, and there also the QAnon theories offered type of instruments. It was a conspiracy that was developed and adapted in language and formats to the different type of social media. And this is something that I think is relevant to say, especially for this regressive movement. It was also highly sponsored. So it is not just a spontaneous development, but there was a lot of investment of funds and monies. Of course, the type of development of communication media during the pandemic with social media, isolation, echo chamber, and all this helped. But it was not a spontaneous effect of isolations in private, in face-to-face interactions and global connections in the social media. It was also highly sponsored, highly politicized type of conspiracies that interacted with other existing ones, like the 5G conspiracy in the environmental areas in this new age milieu, and the great replacement conspiracy on the far right, saying that there is a cosmopolitan elite that tries to substitute the nationals. And these were quite, developed. So vaccinations considered to attack the national genes and to substitute for others the chemtrails conspiracy, assuming that these global elites were spraying things from airplanes in order to produce submissions of the people. So this was similar in both countries, but studies about QAnon said that it had penetrated because of this entrepreneurial effort in the German countries first, when arriving from the United States to Europe. And then it had developed also within that new age milieu. So there are research by anthropologists and ethnographers who were quite surprised to find out that people they considered as more naturally oriented towards solidarities, and instead votes the content of the QAnon type of conspiracies. And eventually, the type of development in both countries was towards a more and more sectarian type of groupings that survived the end of the pandemic by focusing on other issues. At the moment, it is especially anti-gender type of discourses, so considering gender as another sort of mischief of cosmopolitan elite, and even climate denialism, which would be apparently against the developments, the assessments, the framing of the new age exoteric milieu, but it's also penetrated in this. So eventually, I think there are many similarities, but it is also true that there are quite a lot of differences in the ways in which anti-vax protests developed in different countries. And it is interesting to note that, for instance, we had very little protest and very high rate of vaccinations in countries in Europe that were considered to be as sort of less civic, like Portugal or Spain. Portugal vaccinated 94% of the citizens without any type of protest whatsoever. Also in Spain and in Greece, the protests were quite low. So it was sort of a reverse or challenged the expectations about the civicness, and probably was related with different type of organizations at the level of the states and investment in this type of resistance to the pandemic in terms of anti-contagion measurement, but also the characteristics of these different milieus that mobilized in other countries.
Thank you, Donatella. I think it's so good for all of us, because we are a community of researchers looking at violent extremism. So what we are trying to understand are the boundaries, the lines between legitimate dissent and, extremism or violent extremism. So in this sense, I wanted to ask you, and I will merge two questions in one, I apologize. So about your opinion about the category of anti-government extremism, which is more and more used in policy, academic circles. So first of all, I wonder if you think it is truly novel that anti-government extremism exists, or if in the past, to what extent many social movements that used violent actions were basically anti-government across the board, left and right, and anarchists. And the second is, how can we, because to an extent it's even good, healthy in a democracy to be anti-government many times. So when does an anti-government social movement become extremist? And when should we start worrying about it?
Yes, it's a very relevant question, and I think, in fact, that labels such as radical or extremism are quite tricky to use at the scientific level, because they would need definitions of thresholds, which are very subjective, historically bounded, and related also with different cultural expectations. So just to give an example, forms of protest that in France are routine, in other countries could be considered as extremely dangerous. Or also during pandemic times, we during the austerity times, we studied anti-austerity movements. And we saw that, for instance, in Portugal, protesters could enter the parliament and interact with their representative, bringing forward critical views, while in Spain they were forbidden to approach even the parliament. So the police intervened, and there were escalations in Spain. In Portugal, I don't want to simplify, but basically they pointed at the common roots in the carnation revolutions and considered the fact that the people entered parliament to contest the government as absolutely legitimate and normal. So there are a lot of these definitional problems, which pushed me in the past to be quite restrictive in considering radicalizations as more related with the means than with the words. So looking especially at forms of actions that are violent, not so much at radical thinking also, because if we look at political theory, philosophy, but also politics in general, many movements have claimed to be radical without meaning that they were going to attack democratic institutions. So I think that this element of using violence should be considered as very relevant, and the definitions of violence is also contested, but could be related with specific historical traditions, and I think would be more useful to avoid producing radicalizations through anti-radicalization policies, which is one of the consequences of very broad definitions of the enemy by the states. So extremism, I think, is a tricky term, but also anti-government is extremely tricky. And to a certain extent, it developed because while in the past, the main categories to address the political violence was the left, the right, right-wing, left-wing, and then there was ethnic type of protest. Then anti-vax protests themselves were considered as difficult to define in terms of left and rights. I claim in my book that anti-vax were regressive, but of course it was not the typical protest of the far right that it could do. And so I was talking with colleagues trying to define these new forms, and in this it is difficult, but also these forms have always existed. So anti-government, I think, is particularly difficult to handle from the point of view of the social scientists, because, as you mentioned, being anti-government is part of the democratic options. And if you start to stigmatize those who oppose governmental type of decisions, then it's democracy itself which is under a risk of being overprotected. And this type of processes of repressions which develop sort of self-fulfilling prophecies is quite widespread. So I think what should be concerned with the means and should focus attentions on groups that use relevant forms of violence when thinking about legal repression. But on the other hand, I think there is also another risk which is related with the type of considerations of freedom of speech that has been considered as one way to legitimize different type of arguments that are also often very, let's say, risky for democracy. So what I mean is that I think that we should also be concerned about what is said, and especially when it is connected with violence, but especially when it is connected also with attacks against the type of weak groups. So when it is exclusive forms of violence, when it is related with the type of repressions of women, of migrants, with stigmatizations. And there I think a libertarian type of view in which everything is allowed can have very negative consequences. So I think that the arguments that based on freedom of speech, you can also attack basic rights of other people, respects and so on, is problematic. There are many dilemmas. For instance, the burning of the Quran, or the statement by Imam against women, parallel to the statement by Protestant preachers about the disease related with homosexualities. All these, I think, are not considerations that one could just put under the general protection of freedom of speech. One should put limits. But here, and I think this is also something that you are very much concerned with. One other element is, once we are concerned, which type of strategies do we use? And while I think that with violence, the sort of criminalization, the legal type of strategies is the main one. When we deal with more cultural type of phenomenon, we also have to use differentiated type of strategies according also to the different connections that we find between the individual groups and the core of this type of beliefs. So for instance, with conspiracy theories in my research, what I saw was that there was also different degrees of commitment from those who produced actually fake news, those who consumed them, those who semi-believed them. And of course, in this case, the repressions could be counterproductive because it could just produce stronger identifications and feeling of victimizations. But on the other hand, I think also in these cases, you cannot use the everything goes type of strategies. And there are also big responsibilities for the spreading of conspiracies is also the platforms that allowed for this spreading. So I think also there is a delicate issues, there are dilemmas and so on, but something needs to be done, because in the past when communications went through a more controlled type of media. There was a problems of freedom of speech, but there was more control. Nowadays, many civil society organizations that perform sort of accountability check notice that the type of responsibilities that platforms in social media takes for the spreading of fake news is very low. And in fact, conspiracy theorists went from those in which there is more control, but probably not enough, like Facebook, to the ones in which, like Telegram, there was lower degrees of control. And so there, I think that it is also a matter of policies towards communications, different dilemmas between the freedom and protections of civil rights of the people, but it's something that cannot be overseen, overlooked.
Thank you very much, Donatella. A related question to what you're describing is this question of the loss of trust. So in your view, to what extent does the loss of trust in institutions drive the sort of adherence to conspiracy and anti-political, anti-gender worldviews? I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the election of, say, Giorgia Meloni in Italy in 2022 and the extent to which this might be considered as a symptom also of this loss of trust.
Yes. There are definitions like post-truth societies that point exactly at this conglomerate of mistrust, in the sense that mistrust in generically defined elite is then spill over to mistrust towards other groups in the societies, migrants people, the diverse people, but also science. And there it is also quite a delicate issue, because critique of science is healthy, as it is critique also of institutions. In fact, many scholars in political science, from Pippa Norris to others, pointed at the fact that democracies need critical citizens. And my progressive activism, the ones I studied in the protests, were very critical of the governments that had cut funds on public health, very critical of the lack of concerns with those who were suffering, lack of concern with social justice and so on. So mistrust could be quite healthy if it is framed in political criticism and the presentations of political alternative. Democracies are said to be strong because can incorporate critique, can allow for critique. There is this famous book by Hirschman, Exit, Voice and Loyalties, which says once loyalty is no longer working, voice is much better than exit, because it allows firms and institutions to improve rather than just be left alone. But the problem here is that it is not just a generic mistrust, but it is also related with political development. So you, Vivian, mentioned Meloni. I think there is an important point to make. Meloni is not prime minister because the right wing parties became stronger, but it was more a shift of votes from Berlusconi, who had already accepted far-right people in governments. So Meloni was a minister of the Berlusconi government, nothing really new. And then with the vicissitudes of Berlusconi, of the Lega, with the can I say, contested leadership of Salvini, made Fratelli d'Italia as the main party in the coalition. But so it was a problem of distributions of votes within the radical right, but it was also another problem which connects with the questions about trust. It was mistakes on the center left that presented itself as divided. The center left had a huge asset because the pandemic had been managed by a center-left government of Partito Democratico and the Five Stars movement that's had been very popular, notwithstanding the lockdown, notwithstanding the pandemic itself. But then the two parties presented themselves as separate, and especially none was seen as able to represent the interest of the weaker groups, socially weaker groups, and so on. And so this was also political mistrust in the parties on the left that was a main reason why Meloni won. Of course, mistrust is something that then hit also those who win. So at the moment, the Meloni government has the trust of about 1/3, slightly more than 1/3 of the populations. And it was elected with a very high percentage of people who didn't go to vote. So it is complex. But I want to also cite another sociologist who wrote about counter-democracy, Piero Zanvalloni, who stated that in an age of mistrust, and we are living in a situation in which many different transformations in societies bring about mistrust, or at least critical views. In order to save democracy, what you need is to construct institutions that may transform mistrust from a challenge into an opportunity. So you need to involve the citizens. And one of the problems during the pandemic was that being an emergency, being related with an unknown virus, being highly technical issues and so on, the decisions moved towards a few. They were justified with the selective use of expert and semi-experts, virologists, media stars, and so on. And so this didn't create enough trust among the citizens. And in my book, I assess the anti-vax protest as quite weak. In many cases, it was just a group launching on the media. I called it disembedded crowdsourced organizational models. So they were not able to root themselves in societies. They used the social media to launch instruments for mobilizations of different type, but then left the people alone interpreting these messages. But at the same time, I think the risk comes from the broader type of mistrust that these protests produce. So not those who went to protest, but these sort of vicious cycles in which people who are already mistrustful tend not to believe, but to stop believing in any visions, and to prefer to retreat. So there, I also think one needs to reflect on how to develop institutions.
That leads to our next question. Sorry. Yeah, how do you think it might be possible for institutions or governments to restore and rebuild trust with these cohorts when they have really disengaged and become quite anti-political in their views?
Well, I think also there one should distinguish. We have groups that I think are difficult to convince to return within democratic type of institutions. There are policies which are also quite have been quite successful about especially groups that are politicized, sort of youth subcultures, in which the radical type of politics is sort of a stage in life, developed within forms of hooliganism and then politicized on the right. And here also type of specific program would be useful. There's been also practice towards different type of religious fundamentalism, and I want to stress again that I found a lot of fundamentalism on the Catholics groups, in the Protestant groups, so not just in one religion. I think there the really difficult issues is to see where to put the border between when something needs to be stopped. So when you have intervene excluding some issues from the public sphere. And when instead you have to use more deliberative forms. This is something that has been debated in Germany, for instance, about Pegida, these far-right groups that develop in the same areas as Alternative für Deutschland. And there were also attempts, especially since it developed on the eastern side, that was the new Bundesländers, the new regions, states in Germany. There was an attempt to develop deliberative forums. But I think one has to consider that some types of activists are not to be convinced, could not be convinced. And this is also the case for the hard believers in conspiracy theories. I don't think that it is possible to use arguments. So one could try. But I think that one has to consider in this difficult search also the fact that broadening too much definitions of radicalism and so on, one risks self-fulfilling prophecies, because if you consider conditions like quite widespread, like having some types of religious belief or having some age times as potential indicators of radicalism, then you end up with rioting people that were not violent in the beginning, but are made violent by what criminologists used to call the secondary forms of deviation. So you are considered a deviant, and you become a deviant because of the way in which you are treated. But I think also the solutions, I'm a political scientist, and I see solutions also in a political restructuring in terms of institutions with the development of different forms of participations, because elections were never enough and are less and less so. You need to develop other forms of political participations that allow citizens to overcome mistrust, to create collective identities, what usually happen in political parties long time ago. But at the same time, I think also that political parties need restructuring. So what we saw is that sometimes trust increases when new parties are invented, are formed. When transformations happen in the way of thinking about inequalities. From this point of view, the pandemic could have brought about some discursive opportunities by making quite visible the fact that we need each other and we need states that implement rights. And I think this is all connected. So it is not that, to return to the first questions, not that the anti-vax are protests are expressing claim for justice. I don't think so. But that societies in which issues of social justice remain politically unrepresented is a societies in which mistrust tend to grow, and then all governments are subject to fast decline in trust. See Macron, see Meloni as well, Trump, Bolsonaro. So I think one has also to consider what's which type of positive message we have about these societies. So also the challenge of the backlash could be quite, can say, addressable. One can address it because it is also a type of politics that is based on lack of cohesion, lack of trust, and so long-term type of identification.